I, like many cyclists, do not enjoy crashing. But it happens. It's what we might call the cost of doing business, so to speak, in that there's inherent risk in an activity that involves speed, split-second decision-making, and uneven terrain. It's often part of what makes it so fun. The threat of crashing is less of a bug and more of a feature than many of us like to admit, but it's there. Near misses are often more fun and memorable than clean runs, and that tells you a lot about the nature of mountain biking. None of us go out there to crash, but there's a reason why crashes are so popular online. They get shared everywhere because they are somewhat entertaining. When you're mountain biking, the inputs are small, but the consequences aren't. A decision you barely register in speed, angle, or timing can set off a sequence you only recognize when you're already committed to it. Crashes don't start at the moment of impact. That should be obvious. They start several steps earlier, in the places where you assumed you still had control. And it isn't always a misjudgment. Sometimes it's overconfidence. Sometimes it's the belief that your ability will compensate for conditions that don't allow mistakes. Most people think danger will announce itself, but it doesn't. It just builds and it layers. It hides inside the moments that feel routine or under control. And by the time the problem becomes visible, the cascade that creates it is already complete. You see the pattern everywhere, not just on trails, but in life and in the videos where someone films their own death without realizing they've passed the point where recovery is possible. The only difference is the tempo. Some cascades unfold over minutes, others over months, but the mechanism is the same. Each justified choice narrows the next. If you spend any time at all on the internet, especially on video hosting platforms, then there's a good chance you've come across videos that are taken from real life and show tragedies happening in real time. I'm not necessarily talking about the news, but most of us, by a very early age, have been exposed to all manner of horrific incidents. A popular saying in news media is that if it bleeds, it leads, and there's good reason for that. People can't help but watch these types of tragedies unfold. And when we hear that a person has died, we often want to know how they died. What was the cause of death? Humans have an unending curiosity about the deaths of others. And even if you're not somebody who's actively looking for gore videos online, the reality is that it's a very short distance from a gym fail compilation showing people dropping weights or falling off benches or misusing cable machines to a person being crushed under hundreds of pounds of weight because they're not strong enough to support the barbell during a squat. And the internet is full of these types of videos. A collection of horrible fates, they say, edited together in a morbid retelling of awful situations made all the more compelling because of the gruesome ends. One that resonated with me more than I expected was titled, "The Tragedy of Filming Your Own Death." The channel had compiled several news articles, interviews, and footage itself. People in a variety of circumstances who, for one reason or another, had filmed their own death. I'm not talking about self-harm here necessarily. What I'm talking about are people attempting stunts or goofing around with friends in places they shouldn't be, which often leads to the unfortunate FAFO moment playing out on camera for everyone to see. One thing that stands out to me in all of these videos is the decision cascade that occurs, leading to a death spiral. And when you start looking at these events sociologically, not as isolated accidents, but as patterned failures, you see the same scaffolding repeating. People say these deaths are needlessly tragic, as if randomness or foolishness or bad luck were the defining elements. They aren't. They're just the final frame of a process that started long before the camera came out. What you're looking at is the terminal point of a decision cascade, a series of small, justifiable choices that eventually remove every pathway except the one that leads to collapse. And once you recognize that this scaffolding repeats, you start noticing which vantage points make the pattern unavoidable. I learned it in sociology, studying how systems fail exactly the way people do, incrementally, quietly, and often predictably. That's why those videos stay with me. Not because the endings are dramatic, but because the beginnings look exactly like every other ordinary day. And once you've seen enough of them, you start recognizing that same scaffolding in places where most people don't think to look. As a former police officer who investigated traffic fatalities, homicides, workplace deaths, domestic incidents, and all manner of preventable tragedies of every kind, I spent years tracing backward through sequences of decisions that led to irreversible outcomes. And my years in combat sports, fighting, coaching, teaching self-defense, just reinforced one of the most important truths I know. Personal safety doesn't start when someone confronts you. It starts several decisions earlier. Something that has always stood out to me in the forensic audits of these incidents is that by the time you need saving, it's already too late. Sociology taught me to see these not as isolated failures, but as patterned behaviors shaped by systems. And it's through the convergence of those experiences that I learned to see the pattern long before most people think it begins. This doesn't make me immune to it, but it does make me aware of it. A decision cascade occurs when one choice, usually made under pressure, urgency, or some type of social expectation, sets out the conditions for the next until the person is no longer in a position to make an informed decision themselves. They're just following the logic they themselves installed. And it's not a decision that's made because of yesterday's choice, but because yesterday's choice is now today's baseline. And each choice made perfect sense in the moment it was made. Each one was justified by the one that came before it, but each one narrowed the options for the next. That's how decision cascades work. They don't require dramatic choices, just incremental resets of what's normal. From a structural perspective, this is how social systems reproduce themselves within individuals, one adaptation at a time until the person mirrors the pressures around them. And this is where the invisibility problem begins. Cascades hide themselves because each step feels justified by the one before it, making the collapse structurally coherent long before it becomes visible. The death spiral that follows in some cases is simply what happens when a decision cascade hardens into a terminal trajectory, when the chain of justified choices reaches a point where survival is no longer guaranteed. People assume wrongly that spirals begin with collapse, but they don't. They begin oftentimes with competence. They begin with a person successfully adapting to strain. They begin with performance. I've seen this in fighters long before they lose. Their footwork starts to stiffen, their shoulders start to rise as their breathing sharpens. The body is narrowing its options while still somewhat looking composed. And I saw this in policing too, reviewing files where the final moment looked sudden, but the near misses had been accumulating for hours and sometimes even years. The outward competence hid the internal narrowing. And video reveals the decision points that narrative often obscures, tiny opportunities that could have led somewhere else. The decision cascade doesn't appear as a limited set of options leading to ruin or salvation. It appears infinite in scope and potential until the death spiral begins. And even that doesn't present as breakdown. It presents like composure, grace under pressure, the simple choices that people make in the here and now that have downstream effects only considered when they start to pull a person apart. Withdrawing from relationships in favor of work becomes focus. Skipping meals becomes discipline. Suppressing emotion becomes professionalism. Reduced presence becomes efficiency. And you start to notice when all of these self-inflicted efficiencies come from elimination, not optimization. This is what disappearing margin looks like. This is what competence turning into a spiral looks like. They let go of recovery, connection, reflection, nourishment, growth, but what remains is output and momentum. And from the inside, that diffusion doesn't really feel like avoidance. It feels like time itself is warping and narrowing their field of awareness until only the next decision remains. Time starts to distort. The future collapses into the present. The past becomes a list of tactical lessons rather than a narrative, and the present becomes the only thing left. A kind of hypertrophy now where everything must be handled immediately at the cost of everything else. There's only one posture I've ever found that can interrupt that collapse, and it isn't strength or insight. It's the ability to tolerate the space before the next decision. Maybe you can name the pattern. Maybe you can even question the premise just not the execution. But you slow the tempo. You hold open the smallest possible space for a different decision to appear. If the cascade or spiral compresses time into an endless tactical present, then negative capability is the ability to hold that present open long enough for another path to appear or even reappear. The poet John Keats described it as the capacity to remain in uncertainty without irritability reaching for fact or reason. And it's the stance that interrupts the spiral's demand for momentum or the cascade's need for attention, not by force, but by refusing its logic, not by solving, but by creating space, the smallest possible unit in which a person can still make a different decision. Or, as Viktor Frankl stated it, between stimulus and response, there is a space. This, unfortunately, won't reverse a death spiral already underway. But applied earlier, while still in the cascade, it can be the difference between hardening and exiting. It might slow the acceleration long enough for recognition to occur. You see the downward turn beginning as the cascade starts to spiral, much like a tragedy beginning with the ending already visible when you have the benefit of safety and distance, quiet signals hardening into warnings, warnings into certainty, certainty into the thing you hoped you wouldn't have to watch. And you begin to recognize when adaptation starts to look more like erasure in progress. Because once recovery is dismantled, rebuilding becomes almost impossible. Then we blame the person and not the entropy that was occurring. The so-called Darwin Award winner commentary from those on the outside looking in, condemning the dead for succumbing to something preventable as if it were a moral failing. But a death spiral isn't about a weakness of character, a failure of prioritization maybe, but not a single static characteristic. It's about forward energy. It's about cascading logic driven by structural pressures, some avoidable, others not. Some people withstand these pressures longer than others, but the variation is mostly due to resources, timing, and luck, not moral character. People reduce a lifetime to a single moment, ignoring traits in favor of condemning states. And the hardest part is that the line between reversible and terminal is invisible from the inside. The cascade and the spiral don't announce which version you're in. By the time you're naming it, the person capable of escaping may not exist anymore. That version of them is gone, already dead if we're being honest. And the version of them left alive might not be for much longer. But this isn't nihilism in service of hopelessness. It's realism in the service of prevention. That's ultimately why I'm even examining these ideas. What might we have done differently if presented with the same environment, the same situation, and the same people? Maybe we would have noticed when someone's success requires systematic sacrifice, or when every achievement is purchased with something irreplaceable, or when slowing down feels impossible rather than inconvenient. And while it's easier to see a spiral from the outside, recognizing your own is harder because the distortion feels like clarity. Probably because, cliche as it is, you never feel more alive than when you're close to dying. So these videos will continue to be made. Someone will set up a camera, someone will die on camera. Someone else will narrate calmly, someone else will say needlessly. The rest of us will watch and wonder why. What was the point? But now you know what they're not showing. The years of justified decisions. The cascades that looked like commitment. The systems that rewarded risk-taking. The metrics that praised a lack of safety measures. The reviews that valorized depletion. The society that mistook momentum for meaning. The culture that celebrated the loss of the individual. Life is beautifully imperfect in this way. It's the unpredictability of daily living and activity that brings meaning to the reliable moments, even if only in retrospect, the ones that feel like core memories or formative moments. The asymmetries of our lives are often exactly why we hold them so dear. Death, however, is ugly in its symmetry. Dying can often be a perfect sequence of poor decisions once it's far too late and we're far too gone to do anything but accept that we're already dead. We just don't know it yet. You might even be watching me ride my bike right now and anticipating the crash that is coming. Or is it? Because you don't know whether what you're watching is me in the midst of a decision cascade that is possibly leading to a death spiral. All you know is that I turned on a camera and took a risk. But whether I navigated those risks successfully remains to be seen.